like Pablo said, I've been interested in this topic of fascism since Steve Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt, who Fred was talking about, that book, Tyranny of the Minority, published an article in Foreign Affairs in 2016 that said, that asked the question, is America safe for democracy? And it was that article that kind of took me down this path of beginning to go into a deep dive about democracy, authoritarianism, and fascism. And I did a lot of presentations, starting actually with the adult forum at the UU Church, and then spreading out to indivisible groups, Rotary clubs, some other groups up and down the coast here in the Gulf Coast here in Florida. It did talks on HR1, and so now I'm still back into it because things haven't resolved. So I'd like to take you through some ideas tonight about fascism, and then hopefully have a great conversation with you about it. So I start with this little quote from Mehmet Murat Idlin: "Let fascism find not even a single passage to power, or else that poisonous snake will infiltrate into every vital corner of the country and kill the future of the nation." Interesting beginning. So let's see, advance. So the question this evening that I'd like to pose is, our nation experiencing a full-blown fascist political movement? And is the coordinated assault on transgender people the final proof of such a movement? Within the last year or so, leaders have been using the word fascism. So Robert Reich in July of 2023, just a few months ago, said a Trump loss in 2024 will show that Americans reject fascism and cherish the rule of law. Steve Schmidt, former Republican strategist and member of the Lincoln Project, in September last year said MAGA is a fascist movement. American First was a fascist movement and it remains so. And even President Biden in August last year said, what we're seeing now is either the beginning of the death knell of extreme MAGA philosophy. It's not just Trump, it's the entire philosophy that underpins the, I'm going to say something, it's like semi-fascism. Representative Ocasio-Cortez said Republicans may think they won today in Tennessee, but their fascism is only further radicalizing and awakening an earthquake of young people, both in the South and across the nation. And right here, the youngest member of Congress from Florida, Representative Maxwell Frost, said, I've had people tell me to stop using the word fascist in talking about Governor DeSantis and what's going on in Florida. I won't stop. This is what's going on. I won't tone down my language when we are actively being oppressed. This is my home. And even Jamie Rankin, Representative Rankin, said two of the hallmarks of a fascist political party: one, they don't accept the results of elections that don't go their way, and two, they embrace political violence. He said that's why Joe Biden was right to sound the alarm that this week about the continuing attacks on our constitutional order from the outside by Donald Trump and his movement. So we have leaders using the term, but there's not a consensus about whether that's an appropriate use. Why it's important is that democracy is incompatible with fascism. And when fascism arrives, the democracy ends, civil rights and freedom disappear, the rule of law is abandoned, a culture of surveillance, secret police, and citizen informers emerges, talent flees the nation, women's rights are severely restricted, political corruption is unrestrained, the risk of war is heightened, and targeted minorities and, quote, enemies risk harassment, assault, imprisonment, and death. This is a dystopian, terrible future for our nation if this is a fascist campaign that could achieve its goals. So the the country's antennas went up early on this issue of fascism and former President Trump. This was before the election, this Washington Post article, How Fascist is Trump? It was October of 2016. It's an article by J.R. McNeil. And they went to 7 fascist experts, historians, and asked them to give them kind of the elements of fascism. They gave them these 11 elements or traits and asked them, and then tried to score Donald Trump on these. And their scoring method was that they would give up to 4 points for each of these. And they called them Benitos, 4 Benitos, 2 Benitos, after Benito Mussolini. But a bit tongue in cheek, but they scored them, and what they came up with was about 26 out of the 44. Hyper-nationalism, militarism, glorification of violence. You can see the scoring down, and this was before he even attained office. You know, I think if you went to the end of his term, most of those numbers went up. His hyper-nationalism, his militarism, his propensity to promote violence. Down there at number 10, his party structure and tendency to purge the disloyal. He was a master at getting rid of people who weren't loyal to him. His numbers would have gone up significantly. But this was even before most of the nation knew who Donald Trump was. And in 2016, according to Merriam-Webster Dictionary's online dictionary, fascism was the second most sought after word for an understanding of what it was on their online dictionary after surreal. And the definition of fascism that they provide, I think, is really quite an excellent definition. The important point about the way they start this out is that it can be a political philosophy or ideology. It can be a movement or a campaign style, or it can be a regime. And their definition states that it's one of those that exalts the nation, nationalism, and often race above the individual, and that stands for a centralized or autocratic government headed by a dictatorial leader. Severe economic and social regimentation, such as patriarchy, or oftentimes religious edicts, and forcible suppression of opposition, violence. So you have this set of ideas that seem to come together in the concept of fascism. One of the most outspoken alarmists, I would say, early on was Umair Haque, who lives in London. He writes for Medium, and he's a prolific writer about America's dilemma around capitalism and fascism. But he said, America doesn't understand fascism, and this is back in 2017. He said, Orwell once said that the hardest thing is to see what's right before one's nose. And that in my life, I don't think I've ever seen a society's intellectuals, pundits, and leaders get anything as wrong as America's got the rise of fascism. America needs to wake up. Fascism exists for a reason, to ration the dwindling fruits of a stagnant economy. He says capitalism is imploding into fascism. This entire set of ideas regarding our descent into fascism is still absolutely unmentionable in polite society, polite company. You won't read about it in the New York Times. Nobody on CNN will say it. And if you don't name it or call it what it is, you can't effectively deal with it, fascism. So much of the nation found themselves, I think, in this situation where over on the left, these are democratic discussions around culture wars, liberals versus conservatives, and this kind of anti-elite populism. These are ideas were passed around on the news media, and this is how we were talking about what was happening in our country. And really, the national media reporting was all within that scope. You rarely heard them speak about illiberal democracies, Christian theocracies, extreme populism, or fascism. These words and these concepts weren't discussed. And so most of the nation was there on the left side thinking this is where we're operating. The problem was, if we're really heading towards extreme right-wing populism or fascism, conditions that aren't compatible with democracy, then there's this great gap in the general population's understanding of where we are and what the threat is. So why is that gap in understanding there? And one of the reasons, I think, is that some of our experts on fascism really failed us. One of the articles that came out in October of 2020 was, "Is Trump a fascist?" Eight experts weigh in, and this was on a report in Vox. And the underlying below the headline was, "Call him a kleptocrat, an oligarch, a xenophobe, a racist, even an authoritarian, but he doesn't quite fit the definition of fascist." And this is the list of experts, and you can see they're from Columbia University. Robert Paxton is author of a classic book on the anatomy of fascism. And you see Columbia, University of Texas. These are experts, and Jason Stanley down at the bottom there. And I think it's worth listening to what a couple of these people said about Trump. And this starts with Roger Griffin in Oxford. He said, "Trump's relationship to democracy, I would really insist, is the key to answering whether he's a fascist or not. Even in 4 years of incoherent and inconsistent tweets, he's never actually done a Putin and tried to make himself a permanent president, let alone suggest any coherent plan for overthrowing the constitutional system." Now, look back at the time of this. This was October of 23 and 2020, a month before the election. He said, "I don't even think that it's in his mind. He's an exploiter, he's a freeloader, he's a wheeler and dealer. That's not the same as an ideologue. So he's absolutely not a fascist. He doesn't pose a challenge to constitutional democracy." And Sharon Berman at Columbia said, "I don't like applying the term fascist to Trump. Trump maintains his support by engaging in explicitly divisive appeals designed to pit groups against each other, particularly but not exclusively ethnic groups. Also, of course, bears some similarity to what fascists did. And of course, Trump is undermining various norms and institutions of democracy. But this doesn't make him a fascist, which means much more than these things." Calling Trump fascist gives him too much credit. He isn't strategic enough, ideological enough, or ambitious enough. And as bad as things are today, we are still not in 1930s Germany. And Robert Paxton at Columbia said, "I still stand by what he had written, that Trump wasn't a fascist." I'll just summarize this, but he says, with the increasing potential violence, that he's getting closer to the line. There's still no state management of the economy here, as there was to a degree in Nazi Germany and fascist Italy. So I still think terms like oligarchy and plutocracy work for Trump, with the added thought that he is close to crossing the line with his toleration of violence. And only Jason Stanley spoke perhaps in the direction of what he saw as a fascist political campaign. He said, "There's a fascist regime. We don't have a fascist regime," he stated. But he said, "I certainly think he's using fascist political tactics. I think there's no question about that. He's calling for national restoration in the face of humiliation brought on by immigrants, liberals, liberal minorities, and leftists. He's certainly playing the fascist play." Most important things he said is, if you're only worried about fascist regimes, you're never going to catch fascist social and political movements. The goal is to catch fascist social and political movements and fascist ideology before it becomes a regime. So Paul Street, in his book, This Happened Here, has a whole chapter on what he calls fascist deniers. And he has a list of things that he thinks are the mistaken ideas that some of these historians use. One is to expect fascism in 2022 to look like fascism in 1939. The second is that requiring all elements of a fascist regime be in place before calling it fascism. The third was believing Trump isn't a fascist because he isn't an ideologue. even though he had a long history of white nationalism, racism, and misogyny. The fourth was claiming Trump isn't a fascist because he hasn't yet destroyed our democracy. The fifth was giving Trump a fascist pass because he appears clownish, a narcissist, is focused on his personal power, or appears inept. And finally, he said, claiming Trump shouldn't be labeled a fascist, even if he's surrounded by white nationalists and is leading a fascist mob. So there was an article by Luis Dean Valencia Garcia, who is at Texas State University, and he studies fascism, that I thought was very interesting. He said, for years, scholars have argued Donald Trump has X quality, but not Y fascist traits. He says these academics look at the worst case examples where fascism resulted in war and genocide and started their point of comparison from the worst case scenario, rather than considering what does fascism look like before it gains power or has a following. What's at its core? And he said a simple definition of fascism, kind of taken from away from its historical basis, but more of a generalized thought, was this combination of racism, anti-intellectualism, anti-liberalism, xenophobia, ethnocentrism, nationalism, queerphobia, and misogyny. And he said that equals fascism. And while the quantity of each X factor varies, he said the combination of these in any quantity forms fascism. And when you look at that list that he's talking about and the definitions of those, you go down this list, and the MAGA party and Donald Trump demonstrates all of these. So let's step back at it in a different way to frame this. Remember, there were these three concepts of what fascism is: an ideology, a campaign strategy, and a regime. So if the leader or party believes in or expresses a fascist ideology, does that make them a fascist? If the leader or the party campaigns using fascist techniques, or if when in power, the leader or party creates a fascist regime or a fascist state. And I'd like to look at these three things briefly, each. So the question about what we're seeing is, are the leaders of the party driven by a fascist ideology? And again, there's the definition of fascism on the left. And I don't think that one of the things that's really confounded us is that Trump really doesn't have a visible ideology. He's never expressed a platform or a list of his beliefs. We know that he used to be a Democrat. He used to be he was used to support abortion. I mean, he switched his position on so many things that there's this belief that he has no ideology behind his method. But I think the important thing to notice is who he has surrounded himself, who leads the party. And you go from General Flynn, Christian nationalism, to Steve Bannon, Breitbart, who is an alt-right person, Stephen Miller, a white nationalist, and the neo-Nazis in Charlottesville and that support him and see him as their leader. And you get this whole list of common beliefs that are kind of the basis of the fascist ideology. And I think if you go down this list, you can see he's surrounded with people, including militarism. You know, he appointed more generals to his cabinet than any president in the past. All of these show up on the people that are closest to him. So I would say regarding, are the leaders of the party driven by a fascist ideology? I would say yes, recognizing that Donald Trump himself is someone that we aren't sure what his ideologies or whether he's an ideologue. I think the second question about the fascist campaign is a little easier to see. And I go to this book by Jason Stanley, How Fascism Works, to look at what are the tools or the approaches that a would-be demagogue would use to draw in a portion, the dominant portion of their base, into kind of this leadership cult. What do they do that makes it so successful and creates this mass movement? And I think the primary tactic is that Jason Stanley lists is us versus them. This concept that I'm going to shine a mirror on my followers about how great they are and point how different everyone else is and how inferior they are. And the secondary tactics he lists are shown there. The mythic past, this make America great again, a water hose of propaganda, anti-intellectualism, this unreality, conspiracy theories, big lies, alternative facts, hierarchy, victimhood, a tendency of demanding law and order for others, but not necessarily for themselves, anxiety around sexual orientations and gender issues, the Sodom and Gomorrah being the rural versus the urban conflicts about morality, and then a great mock free, I pronounced that correctly, was a sign over one of the concentration camps in Germany. Work will make you free is this concept that if poor people simply work, they'll become free. So how does this work in this us versus them? Every mechanism of fascist politics, according to Jason Stanley, works to create or solidify the distinction between us and them. And I would say that when you're doing that around party policies, our policies versus their policy, that's legitimate political debate. When it's us versus them, common man versus elites, that's the populist attack. But when it's us versus them related to race, gender, religion, nationality, sexual orientation, this is the fascist attack. And I think this is one of the most defining issues, is who are they attacking? And is it on the basis of policies and ideas, or is it on the basis of identity? So I won't go through this all, but we have examples of how all of these were used by Trump in his campaign to gain power. So I would say that Trump's campaign was kind of a classic use of the fascist playbook in order to gain power. And then the third issue is there a fascist regime? Do we have evidence that once in power, that they function like a fascist regime? And here I would suggest that we look at what's happening not with Donald Trump, but what's happening in red states around the United States. And are we looking at an emerging fascist regime? The current state-level GOP attack on transgender people really mirrors the Nazi attack on German Jews from 1933 to 39. And I'll show you why I think there's such a tight and strong parallel. The tactics that are being used were equivalent. That's hate speech, the passage of discriminatory laws, and then the use of intimidation and violence. A couple articles that I would recommend you look up and read related to this issue are ones by Bryn Tannehill, a transgender woman who served in the military. She's written a book on American fascism. She writes in this article, trans people are in grave danger in Dame, a little over a year ago. She said the GOP has focused their vitriol on the trans community, whom they depict as an existential threat to justify their plans to eradicate their existence from society. Sound familiar? When you look at the similarities, you have to look at what Nazis were doing from 1933 to about 1939. This was before they got into the war and the final solution and those things. How were they treating this small bit population of German Jews? German Jews were 500,000 out of 67 million Germans, less than 1%. And the target that I see right now for the GOP, the transgender people represent less than 1% of the American population, 1.3 to 1.4 million transgender people out of 325 million. And while the Nazis had control over all Germany and Austria then, after a few years, what we're looking at here are 12 states under GOP control, where they have basically the trifecta of controlling the House, the Senate, and the governorship. In both instances, the plan of attack was published ahead of time. So you go way back to 1920, and Adolf Hitler had put out the National Socialist 25-point plan. it outlined some of the things that eventually became law. Only Germans could be citizens, Jews can't be citizens, immigration was banned, and Jews couldn't own or work in publications. He went further in 1925 when he published Mein Kampf and set up further criteria. Here in the United States, you have to look at a meeting that occurred by the Family Research Council back in 2015. And at that time, two members, Dale O'Leary and Peter Sprigg, both who have published books, Dale O'Leary's One Man, One Woman, A Catholic Guide to Defending Marriage, Peter Sprigg, Outrage, How Gay Activists and Liberal Judges Are Trashing Democracy to Redefine Marriage. They put together this report called Understanding and Responding to the Transgender Movement in 2015. And this, coming out of that meeting was this plan, a 5-point plan. First, put a ban on changing gender identification on your ID cards, removal of protection from discrimination, a ban on the use of public facilities, denial of coverage for transitioning care, and a ban on serving in the military. So they wrote out their plan in 2015. And then basically there was a national campaign to support that plan. And it started with the hate speech. And I've kind of placed this here so that we can look at the three things that we talked about: hate speech, discrimination, discriminatory laws, and violence. And they line up with the Anti-Defamation League's Pyramid of Hate that you probably all know about. It was based on Gordon Allport's scale of prejudice and discrimination that he developed after World War II back in 1954. But the idea is that as you move up this pyramid of hate, you get increasingly violent and risks for that population of people. So what about hate speech? We know that Adolf Hitler was constantly talking about Jews and the evils of the Jewish people. And even back in 1919, he said the ultimate goal must definitely be the removal of Jews altogether. He spoke of them as parasites in the body of our peoples, and that only when the Jewish bacillus infecting the life of peoples had been removed can one hope to establish cooperation among nations. That was 1939. Well, what's happening here with the hate campaign against transgender people? So the most prolific anti-trans speaker, probably until he was fired, was Tucker Carlson. He referred to trans people as a challenge to the perpetuation of the species, grotesque, predators, a nationwide epidemic, that gender-affirming healthcare is basically molest and abuse children. Abigail Shrier, who writes for Wall Street Journal, published a book, Irreversible Damage, the Transgender Craze Seducing Our Daughters. She states that trans people are brainwashing children, sucking them into a cult, conducting medical experiments, and mutilating them afterwards. Michael Knowles at the Conservative Political Action Committee in April of 23 said, for the good of society, transgenderism must be eradicated from public life entirely. The whole preposterous ideology at every level. And Moms for Liberty, who some of their leadership is right down the street from us here in Sarasota, Florida, tweeted, gender dysphoria is a mental health disorder that's being normalized by predators across the US. And then even Donald Trump jumped into this issue of attacks on the transgender community. He said, I will ask Congress to pass a bill establishing that only genders recognized by the United States government are male and female, and they are assigned at birth. This is an action, this is a discriminatory action that persecutes 1.5 million members of our society, citizens, and really just banishes them. And then to go a step further, we know that the role of the church in at the time of the Nazi regime was one of their biggest moral failures. Remember that 95% of Germans were Christians in 1933, and that Pope Pius XII really dropped the ball in terms of trying to protect the Jewish people. So have they learned from their lesson? Have they learned any lessons from their experience there? what happens in March of 2023 in an interview in an Argentine magazine, Pope Francis states, gender ideology is one of the most dangerous ideological colonizations in the world today. He says it's dangerous because it blurs the differences in the value of men and women. He states that the question of gender is diluting the differences and making the world the same, all dull, all alike, and that is contrary to the human vocation. Here in Florida, Congressman Greg Steube said transgender people are an offense to God. And one of the state representatives during a hearing where transgender people were in the room said, "The Lord rebuke you, Satan, and all of your demons, and all of your imps will come and pray before us." And Tucker Carlson says trans people are the natural enemy of Christianity. Trans movement is targeting Christians. So that's the hate speech. The discriminatory laws are the next thing that raises the issue of moving up the pyramid of hate. And Jason Stanley refers to the passage of these laws as the legal phase of a fascist movement. This pyramid of hate is well described in Jonathan Greenblatt's book, It Could Happen Here. He's the CEO of the Anti-Defamation League. So both in Nazi Germany and in the current day Republican Party, they're targeting transgenders' civil rights, their education, healthcare, their public life, identification, marriage and family, and employment. They're really covering all aspects of their life, trying to make it impossible for them to function. In Germany, between 1933 and 1939, 1,448 laws or edicts were passed, with the most famous ones being in 1934, the Nuremberg laws, some of which were modeled after some of the race laws in the United States. And in our current time, since 2019, there have been 1,025 bills or laws that have passed related to transgender people. You can see in 2023, there were 563 bills introduced, 80 of them passed, 355 are active at the time when this was put together. But it's a remarkable similarity between what the Germans did towards the Jewish minority and what GOP controlled states are doing towards transgender people. This is kind of shows the expansion of the laws, the 5 laws around banning gender identification, etc., how they've grown. And the red states are the ones where bills have been signed. The bills in the assault on the Jewish people in Germany included assault on children's education. They capped the number of Jewish people that could be enrolled. They banned Jewish teachers. In 1938, they segregated schools, and in 1942, they banned education for Jewish children. Bans that are going on now in these states around transgender children, around the use of their proper pronoun, banning books and authors or discussions about transgenderism, banning their use of the appropriate identity bathroom, and banning them from sports. And finally, one of the other ways that you can kind of see comparisons are the way that they required that this minority identify themselves. In 1938, every Jew in Germany had to take on the middle name of Sarah or Israel. They were required to have a J stamped on their passports, and then in 1941, when they were in public, they had to wear a yellow star. Whereas what's happening here now is that trans people are required to put their birth gender on their identification cards, which means that anytime someone checks their ID, they can see that there's a disconnect between their appearance and their gender, and it outs them as a transgender person. And finally, violence is kind of the third stage of this kind of a campaign. It can be stochastic, it can be done by paramilitary people, or it could be state-sponsored. And we know that GLAAD has reported 161 instances of anti-LGBT protests and threats in 2022. Proud Boys, white supremacists, and religious extremists harassing them, oftentimes carrying weapons. We know that states have been passing laws intended to ban drag performances. And we know that in many of these states, just like in Germany, the persecuted population is looking for safer places to run to. So we know that about 60% of Germans between 1933 and 1938 left Germany seeking safety. Aaron Reed, shown on the right, is a transgender activist who published this trans safety map that shows places that are safe for trans people to go. And notice that Florida, she has listed as a do not travel location because of the felony for using the inappropriate bathroom. So Umar Haque said that fascism at best seen as a kind of theft from the nation, a deep and profound theft, the deepest theft of all. It proceeds as a theft of rights, theft of norms and values, theft of democracy, theft of decency and humanity. And beyond that, that the in-group proceeds to rob those less powerful than they are. Everything without guilt or shame or fear. They steal their dignity, their belongings, their selfhood, their work, their social milieu, and their possessions in their lives. And we've seen that happen right here at New College with the takeover by the DeSantis administration of this once very friendly small college atmosphere, which we can talk about some more. So looking at this, I believe that there's evidence of the fascist ideology surrounding Trump, that he's used fascist political tactics to gain power, and that now we're seeing in those places where states have total control over their legislature, this campaign of hate, persecuting, violence, which is classic the Nazi persecution of the minority. This is a comparison that I won't go through in detail, but before I close, I want to read something from the Des Moines paper in 1938 about fascism. It says, fascism's aim is to forge the tribe into an instrument of brute power. It's an exaltation of naked force, a Nietzschean assertion that nothing else has reality. Life is conceived as a thrust of power. Men were made for power, to be agents of power, wielders of power, and slaves of power. Humanitarianism, says Hitler, is a mixture of stupidity, cowardice, and superciliousness. Fascism springs from soil. Fascism is real and ready threat, not so much on account of its triumphs in certain foreign parts, as on account of its ability to spring from native soil. We would be fatally mistaken if we thought of it as something which is imported, brought in, or superimposed from the outside. But fascism is always native. It grows from within by promising a quick and easy solution to the problems that press upon liberal, semi-democratic, capitalistic nations in the present world. It follows the line of least resistance, manipulating existing prejudices and passions, taking advantage of the popular fears and the inner conflicts of a troubled society, playing upon the eternal popular demand to be saved from something. And in that same article in 1938, they published this cartoon, and it shows America walking off the edge into fascism. They know not where they go, followed by a banker and some other members of society. And all of those little statements up above in the cartoon are anti-Semitism, security, cure-alls, things that are shown down. So my thoughts are that our nation is rapidly really awakening to the profound threat to our democracy posed by the MAGA GOP. And I believe there's sufficient evidence to label the movement fascism based on underlying ideology of the people that are in power, the political tactics that were used, and the governing actions of red states. And that using such terms as populism, right-wing extremism, oligarchy, illiberal democracy, or plutocracy doesn't communicate the level of threat to our democracy that people need to hear. The GEO campaign to eliminate a whole class of citizen from society moves this threat from simply authoritarianism to fascism. and that we urgently need to raise citizen understanding of what this threat means. It's time to call it what it is, fascism.
Thank you so much, Dale. So I'm going to ask Paulette to stop the recording now so that we can have a discussion. We want to create a